because they were controversial. So some people in the community thought that, you know, we should react in one way and some people another. And through the controversy, I'm hoping to illustrate a bit about the thinking of people within the free software community. Okay, so the first one I've picked on is something called TiVoization. And you saw the TiVo that Bob had here on Friday. And so the TiVo is this personal video recorder put out by a company called TiVo, which is based in somewhere in Mountain View in California. And very, very popular personal video recorder in the United States, hugely popular. It also is sold in the United Kingdom and most recently in Australia. And there may be some other countries that have it now as well, I'm not sure. Now the TiVo was based about a Linux kernel and a number of Linux tools, a Linux user space, so the glibc library and other basic user space tools, but with a set of proprietary applications on top of it that created this very user-friendly interface that people like to use to watch TV and record TV programs, etc. Okay, so the first controversy that came up was they had some proprietary hardware in the TiVo. So the TiVo had some custom chips, so some field programmable gate arrays and various other custom chips built just for the TiVo. And they didn't release specifications for those chips, but they had to write drivers for the kernel so that the kernel could drive these video chips to do the right thing, to encode video, display video, etc. Now, they decided when they released the TiVo, they did create a tivo.com/Linux site which contained tarballs of the necessary material, the source code they used to make the open source parts of the TiVo. So they released a tarball of the exact kernel version that they used. They released a tool chain, so there was a cross compiler available so you could download it and compile stuff. They released the various libraries and some of the user space applications that they had modified in building the TiVo. So that meant they were doing that in order to try and meet their obligations under the GNU General Public License version 2, which was the license that most of those tools were released under, those free software tools. But they didn't release the source code for the proprietary kernel modules. So there was modules that were part of the TiVo distribution that drove the video, etc., and they didn't release any source code for those modules. Now what do you think? Is that okay or is that not okay? What do you think?
It comes out of that derived work.
Comes out of derived work, that's right. And there's both the ethical question and there's the legal question, right? So let's look at it first of all just from an ethical point of view. Do you think that they had any ethical obligations to release the driver source code?
I think they did.
You think they did?
I do.
Okay. Does anyone disagree?
I don't necessarily disagree, but I can definitely see a counter-argument that because the equivalent of a kernel module could also be considered the equivalent of an application, just an application running in user space. So you have the ability to create proprietary applications in user space. Why shouldn't you have the ability to create proprietary applications in kernel space?
Okay. So looking at purely from the ethics, not from the legal side, hands up who thinks that they did have an ethical obligation to release the source code to those modules. Yeah? Okay. Hands up who thinks they didn't have an ethical obligation to release the source code. So, one person? Okay. So the community was a bit split on this. Some people argued exactly as you argued, and many people thought that it was perfectly okay because they thought that those modules weren't really a derived work, that they weren't really based upon the kernel's copyrighted work, and they thought that it was okay for a company to decide to release their own stuff under a different license or not release it at all. Other people thought that they did have an obligation to release those modules as source code and thought that they were doing the wrong thing, either ethically or legally, when they didn't release it. And to this day, that debate still goes on. That particular instance hasn't been tested in court. I'm not aware of anyone actually taking TiVo to court and trying to sue them for infringing the copyright of the Linux kernel. Why do you think nobody has if some people feel strongly about this?
Cost too much.
Cost a lot, that's right, it's expensive, and so because it's expensive, what criterion do people normally apply before they start a lawsuit?
They want to win.
They want to be pretty darn sure they're going to win. Yep. So you'd have to be very, very certain, and the legal landscape in this area is really not quite certain enough to be absolutely certain you'd win. And if you lost, you might have to pay costs. And those costs could be a very, very high bill, could be many millions of dollars, because you might have to pay for TiVo's costs in running the lawsuit. So, as yet, this particular instance hasn't been tested in court. Okay.
What are the parallels to the open source community and how it interacts with the proprietary community?
Right.
In how the open source community creates software based on the interfaces into proprietary systems, and it's all about respecting licenses and
Yes.
whether or not everyone always respects the proprietary licenses and the end user agreements there.
Exactly. There has to be respect going both directions. So, that raises this second point. Is it okay to reverse engineer those proprietary kernel modules to work out how they work so you can modify them? Is that okay both ethically and legally? Which, just from an ethical point of view first, do you think it's okay to reverse engineer those kernel modules to discover how it works? Any comments either way?
Well, it depends on what you're doing with when you reverse engineer it. If you reverse engineer it and then publish it, or then deride your own work and try and copyright that, then that's unethical. But if you're only using it for your own use, then that doesn't seem particularly unethical.
Okay, yeah. So if you published the results of your reverse engineering so that you effectively published in the source code, then there might be an ethical question there, and it may not be ethical. If you don't publish it, then maybe it's okay. Okay, everyone agree with that?
No.
No? Okay.
Well, I actually do a lot of, I do reverse engineering. And
Yep.
my personal take is reverse engineering should always be permissible to a degree.
Okay.
That I don't necessarily see that if they're providing you the binary and the code or whatever,
Yep.
reverse engineering is only looking at the code they provided you.
Right.
So what is the downside of doing it? Where do you draw the line of reverse engineering? Is printing into the screen, is that reverse engineering? Is pulling apart the disassembly? So
Right.
you end up some really moral debates about what reverse engineering is. My
Okay.
take is that if they're giving it to you, you should be able to pull it apart, see how it works. If
I think-
something gives you a car, you should be able to pull apart the engine.
Well, I think if you have agreed not to, that's where it becomes unethical, I think.
Right.
But if you haven't agreed not to do that, I don't think it's unethical. I tend to agree with you. But
Okay.
if you,
So if there's some end user license agreement
If
that
they-
you
yeah,
agreed
yeah,
to
yeah.
that says you're not going to do it, then you shouldn't do it.
that's right. I think
Okay.
that's
Yeah. Okay. Everyone agree with that, or yeah? Anyone disagree?
The other thing is obviously how you do it, and whether or not the user agreement is, are you allowed to use this for a purpose other than what it was originally intended? So you can put it somewhere else and then interface with it and work it out various parts of it based on its interface.
Right. Yes.
Which is sort of how the Samba team.
Right. So you
looks
could
at
work
this.
out. You could publish details on the hardware design, but not necessarily on the code that they use to drive it. Is that what you're talking about?
Something along those lines of sort of how you do it, and once again it comes down to what the agreement was when they gave it to you. They say, yes,
Right.
you can have this, but you can't do anything to it.
Is what matters the legal agreement, or is not what matters the ethics? Because they aren't necessarily the same thing.
Both, and also
Or are they? Do you think they're the same thing?
And also, a lot of the times, what they say or ask you to agree with isn't necessarily the law. Like,
Right.
in certain, especially in some jurisdictions, reverse engineering for interoperability purposes is actually specifically permitted.
Indeed.
Even
Yep.
if they give you some
That's
EULA
right.
which says
That's
you're
right.
not allowed to do it.
There's a lot of ambit claims in legal stuff. So some jurisdictions, the governments in those jurisdictions have specifically said that they bless reverse engineering regardless of what the maker of the device has said. Why do you think they do that? Why do some governments actually specifically say, particularly in Europe, they bless reverse engineering? So why?
Antitrust provisions. Like
Yeah.
anti-reverse engineering is one way to actually block out people from.
That's right. They want to have markets that work well. So in my particular case, I did reverse engineer these kernel modules, and I was thinking about all these ethical questions. So what do you think I did to try to resolve these ethical questions in the best way possible?
Communicate with TiVo.
I communicated with TiVo. Before I published any of my results, I worked out who the actual engineer was in TiVo. It turns out his email address was embedded in one of the binaries. And so I emailed him, and he was very surprised. And I showed him what I'd done, and I asked him, is it okay? Do you mind me doing this? Do you mind me publishing this? And he said, yeah, sure, right? I don't know if he asked his management, right? But that got past any of those ethical issues, right? The individual engineer, notice that the slant here in the free software community is towards the rights of the individual as opposed to the rights of the company. So what mattered to me was the engineer himself. Was he offended? Did he mind? And he was actually delighted. It was quite interesting, and I actually met him and went over there at one stage and had a long chat to him about how things worked, and we discussed it. And later on they actually incorporated my driver that I derived from some of the work that I did reverse engineering, and released my driver in future versions of the TiVo, which is quite extraordinary, you know, given I was reverse engineering this thing at the start. So if you buy a later version of the Series 1 and Series 2 TiVo, it included my driver on it. Okay, so TiVo Series 2. Now what they did in TiVo Series 2, so TiVo Series 1, TiVoization hadn't happened yet. TiVo Series 2 is where we start getting this thing which has become known these days as TiVoization. And what they did was they locked down the kernel. So they changed the ROM, they changed the firmware of the device so that it would only run signed kernels, signed cryptographically by TiVo company. So if you modified the operating system in any way at all, it wouldn't run it. Right? Good or bad? What's wrong with that? What's right with that? Should they be allowed to do that? If not, why not?
Ethically, it breaks the freedom to.
Right. What are the freedoms? So think back to the 4 freedoms of free software. What's one of the freedoms?
Modify.
Right. The ability to modify and redistribute. Yes. Okay. Right. But when it says in that freedom to modify and redistribute, does it mean modify and redistribute on a different device, or does it actually mean being able to modify and run on the original device it was designed for?
It's not clear.
It's not clear.
I think the study thing kind of implies that in a certain way.
It sort of implies it, yeah. Now this one has been quite controversial. Linus Torvalds, who started the Linux kernel, he came out with a very clear statement. He thought this was okay. He thinks it's absolutely fine. He doesn't think that they should be, that putting signing of a kernel is anything wrong, and he thinks that what is important is that their source code modifications are made available, even if it's impossible to use those modifications on the device itself they were designed for. Right? Many other people in the community don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. Right? I think that the GPL was designed to allow you to modify on the device it was designed for, and if you think back to that Xerox printer incident that happened with Richard Stallman, the reason he started the GNU project was for a thing very strongly related to this, very similar incident where the Xerox printer came with conditions that you couldn't give changes to other people to run on similar Xerox printers. Right? So one of the original reasons for the whole creation of the free software movement was to allow for you to modify the source code of your own device. What are your thinkings of this? I mean, how many of you think that you don't be too influenced by me on this. I mean, there's lots of people who think both ways, and I want to sort of illustrate the debate. How many of you would think that it is okay for a company to lock down? I mean, why would they want to do it? What's the technical or marketing justification for locking it down?
So that people can't unlock features and modify for their own use and add features that they don't.
Okay, that's sort of a marketing reason. There's another reason as well that they give.
So people don't break it and then require the company to pay.
Exactly, to lower the support costs. Because if everyone modifies, or if a significant number of people modify their device, it raises the support costs. What's another reason? And this one is specific to media players.
DRM.
DRM, right? DRM systems, and in particular, the media suppliers, the media companies, may be afraid that you can actually take the video off the device and put it onto another device in some way they didn't intend. And TiVo may have been bound by contracts in how they can do this. Okay? How can you resolve, if you're a hacker like me and you want to make these things possible on the device, how can you resolve some of these ethical conflicts? Similar to the resolution of the first one. Talk to TiVo. right? So I wrote a tool called MFS Tools, libmfs, and that tool was an implementation of the media file system, and that made it possible to extract videos off the device and to extract metadata about the videos and bring them onto another device. Now, I wanted to be able to do this because I wanted to be able to play it on my laptop or elsewhere in the house, which is perfectly fine, but it also made it possible to pull the videos and redistribute them, right? So, I met with them and discussed it with them, and they said that the principal problem they had with this was that it would put the TiVo in violation of some contracts they have with their upstream service providers, right? The suppliers of the media, particularly for the direct TiVo. And so they were concerned it could get them into trouble. And so I agreed to delay the release of my code for a few months. They didn't threaten any lawsuit. They didn't tell me I'd done anything wrong. In fact, they told me explicitly that they thought I'd done everything legally okay, and they didn't see anything legally wrong with what I'd done, right? Which was interesting coming from them. And but they asked, could I delay release to give them time to work out the contractual issues with their suppliers so as not to cause them a problem. And I was perfectly happy to do that. I delayed that release. Now, I copped a lot of flack for delaying that release. Many people in the free software community thought I was betraying the free software community by not making that release. So it's interesting, the different attitudes in the community. Some people take the attitude information wants to be free and think, you've got to release. Doesn't matter about the company. Other people take the attitude of cooperating, others think that you just shouldn't touch it in the first place, right? So these attitudes permeate the community, these conflicting attitudes. You need to be aware of these multiple attitudes in your own interactions with the proprietary world where it meets with the free software world. Okay.
What's the result at last?
I eventually did release the library after a few months, right? So
Did they solve the problem with the contractor?
Yeah, they did resolve the problem with the contractors. Apparently, they didn't. I just agreed to delay a few months, and after a few months, I released. And I didn't hear any complaints from them, so I presumed that they solved it.
Oh.
Right? They told me they just needed a few months to sort it out, and I presumed they did. And given I didn't hear any complaints, I released it. Right? And it's now the basis. That project has other people have derived other projects from it, and it's still quite widely used in the TiVo hacking community. Okay, so. The TiVoization is all about, does the GPL guarantee the ability to use the source code or modified source code on the machine for which that code was written? And that's the key question that was being debated, and that's the key to the whole TiVoization phrase, and you'll often hear that phrase in debates on legal issues with free software. Okay, what about GPL v3? So a lot of people were strongly against this TiVoization idea, so it became a bit of a rallying call and to change the license to make it clearer that TiVoization wasn't allowed. So in GPL v2, it wasn't completely clear from the wording of the license that it wasn't allowed. It wasn't completely 100% clear that you couldn't have signed kernels like that. Many people interpreted the license saying no you couldn't. Some people interpreted the license yes you could. There was a bit of a debate. So in GPL version 3, a specific clause was added to prevent that from happening. But in the debate in the committees in creating GPL v3 and among the community when the GPL v3 was being debated, some people objected and said, for medical devices, we need the ability to lock it down. Because for medical devices, you have to be absolutely certain that it's not modified, right? Some people claimed that. And because of that, the clause in GPL v3 only applies for consumer products, and it defines what a consumer product is. So a TiVo is a consumer product. Now, I'm predicting that GPL v4, when it eventually comes out, 10 years, 20 years' time, will extend that to other than consumer products. Because it means that some server-oriented products don't have this clause, and I suspect we will see companies taking advantage of that and doing the equivalent TiVoization in server-type products, and I think the community will react badly to that, and I'm predicting that that will be one of the things that will come up in a future release of the GPL. Okay, so that's TiVoization.
Could you The survived serialization has the whole locked kernel thing, the signed kernel.
Yeah, it's the signed kernel, the ability to, using technical measures to prevent the users of a product from taking advantage of their GPL rights to modify and enhance a product on the device for which the product was designed. So it locked you out of making modifications and improvements for that device, although you could use the improvements on a totally different device, but you couldn't use it on the device for which the code was designed.
As Linux though is GPL v2, and I think Linux
Yep.
has no intention or says he's unable to take it to GPL v3.
Unable is a very strong word. Yeah.
He claims it's unable.
Yes, it would certainly be an awful lot of work. It would be a major piece of legal work to move it to GPL v3.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to call it impossible, but it would certainly be very difficult.
Well, so long as it does say GPL v2 though,
Yep.
it's not. That's probably the main piece that's probably most likely to be TiVo-ized anyway.
Yes, there are quite a few user space tools like BusyBox and others that are often used, the C library and things that are also under GPL that are relevant for machines like this. And so it usually includes 50, 60, 70 utilities and user space as well. But you're right, the kernel has the biggest influence because that is the least easily replaceable part if you want a Linux-based system. Although some manufacturers deliberately use FreeBSD or one of the other BSD kernels because they want to avoid this issue. And the BSD license clearly does not have that requirement. So there are quite a few devices based on the GNU user space tools but a BSD kernel because they don't want to, they want the ability to lock down devices.
But this issue is just a symptom of the digital rights management issue.
It's related to it. It wasn't actually so much DRM in this case as contracts with media companies. In TiVo Series 2, the videos themselves on disk weren't actually DRM locked in most cases. So it wasn't specifically DRM, but it was very, very closely aligned to DRM. It was sort of locking down the whole box as opposed to individual media files, which is normally what DRM is associated with. Yeah. Okay. So GCC and EGCS, this is quite an interesting one. So GCC was a really key component of the GNU system. It's one of the first components that came out in the GNU system, and it was and still is an amazingly high quality compiler developed very fast, originally by Richard Stallman, and now hundreds and hundreds of contributors. Around the time of GCC 2, development started getting bogged down. And there was some very vocal discussions amongst some of the developers expressing frustration with the speed of development and the fact that all the development was gated by the GNU project in a cathedral-style way. So the development could best be called more cathedral than bizarre. So there was a core group of people who made all the decisions, and releases tended to be less frequent. And contributions certainly were made from the outside, many contributions, but not in quite the free-flowing manner of the bazaar-like development process. Okay, so what happened in August 1997? The GCC project forked, which is really quite significant for such a major component of the GNU Linux system, and for lots of other free operating systems as well. So they created EGCS and Extended GNU, Enhanced GNU Compiler System. What does the E stand for? Anyone remember? I should know that. Anyway, I think it might be Enhanced, but I'm not sure. So it particularly, basically what it did is they used a more bazaar-style development model, much more open development style. They broadened the scope of the project, and they tried to make it cover more languages. They aimed for a greater degree of optimization, for example, for the Pentium. In fact, the EGCS fork really came out of an attempt to create a Pentium-optimized version of GCC, plus they added a whole lot of other features to the project. And that fork ran in parallel with GCC for a period of almost 2 years. And during those 2 years, there was quite a bit of debate within the community. Should they have forked it? Did they do the wrong thing? What were they thinking of? You know, was this ethically the right thing for them to do? Should the GNU project abandon theirs, and should EGCS, because it's developed much faster, be the one that's taken on? What happened was in April 1999, after quite a few months of intense discussion between the GNU project and the developers of EGCS, they re-merged again. So it went from a fork back to being a branch and then really the one project. And the fork was resolved and a new steering committee was established, which was an attempt to resolve some of the disputes that had led to the fork. And development has proceeded in a more bazaar-like fashion. Not as bazaar-like as, say, the Linux kernel, but still a lot more open and faster development model than what was used in, say, the GCC 2 days. And that's what's led to the current versions of GCC. And they actually renamed, GCC went from GNU C compiler to GNU compiler collection. I think that's right, what they now stands for, to reflect the fact that the wider scope of the project, that it was now trying to cover a wider range of things than just the core C compiler. So that was a very significant event in the history of free software. It was particularly significant because it involved, in some ways, the project that started it all. One of the first GNU projects, the first free software projects, and pretty much every project uses GCC in some way. Even if you're a Python or Java project, you often rely on libraries underneath that are compiled with GCC. So everyone needs and relies upon GCC, so a fork in that was really a major event in the community. Qt, KDE, and GNOME. Now this was an interesting one. Everyone know what Qt is? You met Qt before? Some people have. So if you use the KDE desktop, then you've used Qt a lot. If you use the GNOME desktop, you also use Qt. Qt is a library of graphical widgets that makes it very easy to create sophisticated graphical interfaces. It's a very high quality library. And it was started by a company called Trolltech in Norway. And they had a business model of selling the library, just like many other proprietary commercial libraries. But what they did was they offered a free version of the library. So there was a free, as in beer, version of the library that was available for people to use if they wanted to. And it was such a very good, high quality library that it tempted many people to use it, including people in the free software community. And they then used a license called the free Qt license. And the free Qt license was semi-free. It allowed, you did have access to the source code, but there were restrictions on exactly what you could do with it. I don't believe you were allowed to port it to a new architecture. You weren't allowed to run it on Windows. There was various restrictions on exactly what you could do with it, so it wasn't strictly speaking free software. Because some of the restrictions, free software requires that there be no field of endeavour restrictions, and so some of the restrictions in the free Qt license meant that it wasn't either free software by the free software definition from the FSF or free software by the open source definition from the OSI. But it was used by the KDE desktop. Now at the time, the KDE desktop was the up-and-coming graphical interface for Linux systems, or GNU Linux systems. Very widely used, extremely popular, very rapid development, extremely high quality desktop. And so there was a big controversy. Here was a major component, the most visible component of Linux distributions is the KDE desktop, right, at the time. And that relied completely upon a library that wasn't free software. Now, a lot of people in the KDE community says it doesn't matter. We know and trust the Trolltech guys. They won't do the wrong thing, right? We know that they're doing good development. Or it doesn't matter because we don't really care about porting it to Windows. We care about creating a great interface on Linux. So there was a controversy within the community as to whether KDE was doing something wrong by basing this graphical interface on the Qt library. What are your thoughts on that? Were they doing something wrong, or was it all okay? Did it matter?
Didn't debate really.
Anyone?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter? You think it doesn't matter which library they use? Many people agreed with you at the time. A lot of people agreed. Anyone else?
It doesn't matter because they have a good graphical user interface.
Okay, it doesn't matter as long as we create a good graphical user interface, right? Who thinks that it does matter in some way? Okay, so why does it matter?
It's not free software. It's about
Right.
the aims versus methods.
Right, aims versus methods debate. Indeed, yeah. And I was concerned, and so, you know, I would have preferred it was a free software library, but I wasn't directly involved in the project in any way, and so I didn't really take an active interest at all in it, like many people. You just ignored it. So, some people were quite concerned, and some of those people decided this actually fueled the development of an alternative desktop environment called GNOME. And that's what you've been using in the lab, right? The normal desktop environment of the computer science and IT department here, the blue screen that you get if you boot the machines by default, that's KDE. What we've been using in this particular course is GNOME. And the two are now both really good desktop environments that are available on Linux systems. Now, GNOME got a big boost from this debate over Qt. And the boost came from the controversy as to whether or not using a non-free library as the default, as underneath the system was okay. GNOME used, of course, a free library underneath. It used libgtk as the core library, which is a library it wrote itself, and a whole lot of applications were written across it on top of libgtk. And both projects thrived in parallel. One with a particular emphasis on free software, the other with the primary emphasis being on the quality of the implementation. So then what happened is Qt 2.0 came out, and that came under a new license, the QPL license. Now, the QPL license was much closer to being a free software license. It still had some special rights for Trolltech, right? But it didn't have the field of use restrictions in the free Qt license, the earlier license. And so Trolltech was expecting that would resolve the problem. I mean, their business model was still to sell proprietary versions of the library while allowing the free version to be used as part of KDE and many other free applications. And they thought that this would completely resolve all the problems. But there was still an issue. The QPL license is not legally compatible with the GNU General Public License. But nearly all of KDE was written under the GNU General Public License. Now, because the authors of KDE chose clearly to use Qt, you'd think there's no problem. Because an author, a copyright holder, can't be accused of violating his own copyright. It makes no sense. Is he going to sue himself? Right? You can't really violate your own copyright in any legal sense. But what if the KDE project, if KDE components utilise GPL code from other projects? If they took pieces of Samba, for example, and used it as part of a KDE component, then maybe the resulting work, which is derived work of Samba, would be violating the GPL because it's linking to a QPL library which is not GPL compatible. And so there was this raging debate on various legal mailing lists. There are all sorts of legal mailing lists associated with the free software community as to whether KDE as a whole was legal. Was it violating its own license, or was it violating the licenses of components that are brought in? Now, what do you think about that?
Why can't they have dual licensing?
They could have had dual licensing indeed, and that's in fact what they did later, right? That was a later solution. So the Trolltech could have, but the reason they didn't initially is they thought they needed the conditions of the QPL to enable their business model to thrive. They were selling, they were paying 20, 30, 40 programmers, and those programmers' salaries got paid by people buying copies of this library, and they bought it because the QPL wasn't sufficient to their needs. And they thought that if they were GPL'd, that less people would buy the library, so they couldn't pay their programmers to improve the Qt library. There was a lot of sympathy for that view. Right? What do you think? Was it okay? Or not?
Well, it's a bad position to be in. If something's breaking one of the licenses and you say that that's fine, then you're really watering down what free and open source software is based on. That
Yep.
If the free software equal their own licenses,
Right.
I expect different.
It sets a bad precedent, exactly, that's true. On the other side, anyone think it's all okay? Doesn't matter? Many people thought both directions.
I think
Right.
it's an easy issue to not pay much attention to.
Indeed, exactly. Lots of people just ignored it and just used KDE because it was a great desktop. Right? Probably the majority of people took that view. Okay? Then in September 2000, because of this raging debate, Trolltech revisited it again, decided, well, their business model could survive it being released under the GPL. So they dual licensed it under the GPL and one of their earlier licenses, and it was for Qt version 2.2. Then the question was, is everything okay now? Well, it was mostly. In fact, nearly all of the legal disputes went away. Pretty much it's now a free desktop, free license, and it was fantastic. Nearly everyone was happy, and their business model did survive. In fact, the company thrived. So it all seemed to be okay, but there was one final twist to the story. In March 2009, last month, after Qt a little while ago got bought by Nokia, and so Nokia had different priorities. Under the GPL, of course, GPL can't be linked to proprietary applications, so this did allow them to still support their business model. Nokia had new priorities. They didn't care about the selling of the library business model nearly as much. They cared about the use of the Qt library on their Nokia devices. And so Nokia decided to add an extra license, so it's now you get to choose whether you use Qt under the GPL or the lesser GPL. And that means now it can be linked to pretty much everything, even proprietary apps. So it's gone all the way from completely anti-use in proprietary for the free version to use in any proprietary application or free application over the years. Quite a change over the years. And so all questions over whether there's any shadow over the KDE desktop are completely gone. And KDE and GNOME are now just stand side by side as alternative desktop environments. The history came from some legal discussions, but now they both stand as great desktop environments which compete on features and cooperate in many cases. Many applications makers cooperate between the two environments, the developers cooperate.
Just a question, how did they make money selling their library once they GPL'd?
Well, when it's GPL, if people wanted to create proprietary applications, the proprietary application couldn't use the GPL version, because otherwise they would have had to GPL the application, would have been proprietary.
So it was still dual license?
They were still dual license. They had the commercial license available, plus which they sold, and plus they had the GPL license available for use in free software.
And why didn't they dual license from the start and avoid all that trouble?
They thought that their business model wouldn't survive it, and it turned out it did, right? But they were concerned, and so it's their work. They can choose how they license it. But of course, it's our free desktop. We can decide what we use with it. And so there was pressure both ways. It's just interesting how things resolve, and develop over time. Okay, Ubuntu. Ubuntu is what you're using in the labs, right? Been around since 2004. It was a fork or a branch of the Debian operating system with, in most cases, a very friendly branch, so a lot of cooperation between Debian and Ubuntu. It aimed for greater usability, widespread adoption, internationalization, very strong emphasis on internationalization, and it had good, strong financial backing from Mark Shuttleworth. Mark made a lot of money out of a company called Thwart, which sold SSL certificates, and he sold that company and became a billionaire, and he had built his business on free software. He decided he wanted to give something back. One of the ways that he could give back to the community was to put money into a Linux distribution that he thought took Linux in the right direction. Okay, and he created Ubuntu. But there have been a number of criticisms of Ubuntu, and these are quite interesting because they show some attitudes within the free software community. First of all, when you install Ubuntu, you have the option under various menu items of allowing for proprietary drivers. So you can allow, if you tick the right box to include proprietary drivers, it will download and install for you various proprietary graphics drivers and other drivers. And that was quite controversial, and their policies on that have evolved over time, so it's not the one policy. That's led to some controversy. Why is that controversial?
Because it can be seen as breaking some of the freedoms of open source software.
That's right, it can be seen as breaking some of the freedoms of open source software. There's another reason though. Right? Remember that TiVo wanted to lock it down partly for support reasons? Think of that in relation to free software. What's the reason?
If you rely on a proprietary driver and something breaks,
Yep.
how do you fix it?
Exactly. If you're relying on a proprietary driver and something goes wrong, and you post a message to a mailing list, a free software mailing list saying, my system isn't working, the such and such has crashed, it might be that it was the proprietary driver that caused it to crash, in which case the community can't help you. And worse, you might waste the time of the community trying to find the bug in their code when the bug isn't in their code at all, it's in the proprietary driver. So the kernel community takes a very strong stance against this, and they have this concept of tainting. Whenever you load a driver that isn't licensed under an open license, or the GPL in particular, then the kernel becomes tainted, and all of your bug reports that come out of the kernel automatically are marked as being tainted. And many kernel developers will just completely ignore your bug reports because they don't want to waste their time trying to help somebody fix bugs that they have no chance of fixing because there's something wrong with this proprietary driver. Okay, second thing is there's been some criticisms in some quarters over whether Ubuntu is giving back enough to the community. Now, the reason for this is some of the other Linux distributions like Red Hat and SUSE employ hundreds of Linux kernel developers and developers for other applications to improve the underlying software. Now, Ubuntu there's a company around it called Canonical, and they're a smaller, younger company with less developers, but they're gaining an awful lot of mind share and market share very, very quickly. Why do you think that upsets some people?
Who's getting the credit?
Who's getting the credit? Yes. It's not strictly about credit. I mean, they do give credit, but it's something else.
They're almost picking up a lot of the benefit of companies like Red Hat and IBM who are paying for people without
Right.
really contributing to the pool.
Right, so some people can think that Ubuntu is picking up the benefits of these other companies contributing, but they're taking away market share from these companies. What's the counter argument to that?
Free software.
It's free software, yes, and this is something that I've participated in debate a little bit. My own view is that Ubuntu has put in an awful lot of work creating this distribution that is extremely polished and smooth with internationalization is itself a major contribution.
But also the developers are not necessarily contributing to the kernel,
Right?
but they're definitely contributing to the desktop environment.
Indeed, they're contributing to the desktop environment. They may be contributing less to the kernel or some of the core pieces, but they're contributing to the overall desktop environment and the experience for users. That's a major contribution. But you should be aware of this criticism. In some parts of the free software community, you may run across criticisms like this, and it's made of many companies. I'm just picking on Ubuntu because there was a recent debate on this on the Linux Weekly News site. This theme does apply in many different projects. Okay, Novell and Microsoft. SUSE Linux is a very popular distribution, especially in Europe and especially in Germany. Linux is extremely widely used in Germany, one of the highest uptake rates in the world. SUSE Linux was bought by Novell in 2003. Novell is the American company famous for making the Novell NetWare networking stack, which is almost defunct now. In November 2006, Novell and Microsoft announced a deal. In particular, they announced an interoperability deal, and nobody really complained about that, but they also announced a patent deal. Now, so what they did was Novell had to pay Microsoft for every copy of SUSE that was sold, and Microsoft paid Novell a large lump of money to seal the agreement. So there was money going in both directions. And Microsoft agreed, in exchange for these considerations of money, that they would not sue Novell's customers. They covenanted that they would not sue Novell's customers for violating Microsoft's patents. Why was that controversial? What was the controversy?
Because only some people were protected from the patent.
Right, only some people were protected from the patent. Why does that matter? I mean, isn't it better to have some people protected than nobody protected from these patents? Is it?
GPL's about protecting everyone.
GPL's about protecting everyone, okay. Yeah. So what happens to the people who aren't protected? In particular, there was a lot of fear in the community that Novell would start, because they no longer had any reason not to include Microsoft patented technologies, that they would start to include technology that may have been patented by Microsoft in their releases. So these applications would develop in ways that the applications could only be used by SUSE Linux, by Novell customers, and couldn't be used by other distributions. That would have fragmented the community. So there was a very strong reaction, and I was part of that strong reaction in lobbying against this agreement. And the way we tried to put it to SUSE is that they had violated, Novell's a company, we had to discuss it with them on a business-like level. And they had violated a rule of business, which is don't do the wrong thing by your suppliers. Now, Novell is in a business that is selling SUSE, but who supplies the materials to Novell that they sell?
Free software.
The free software community. So the suppliers for Novell, the suppliers of the raw material, is the free software community. And they went into this agreement which violated the principles of the free software community without consulting with anyone in the free software community at all. So they were offending their suppliers. That's a really bad idea. If you're a company, don't offend your suppliers. What can happen?
Lose your supply.
Lose your suppliers. They can cut you off. Right? And in some ways that's happened. That led to some of the defensive clauses in GPL v3. For some complex legal reasons, there was a grandfather clause built into v3 that actually allows that specific agreement but prevents future agreements of the same type. Right? And there was a big controversy around in the free software community as to whether this agreement should have been allowed or not. Okay, we're down to the last few minutes. I'll just summarise some of the other controversies. The GNU Linux versus Linux debate is a long-running one. Should people call it GNU Linux or Linux? You've heard me calling it both. Main thing on that is it really is important to credit the efforts put in by the original GNU project. But probably the majority of people call it Linux rather than GNU Linux. The SCO lawsuit is a major one, and I'd suggest you read on Rock Law for the history of that lawsuit. There's some quite amazing things. Look for things about a suitcase and various other things. There's some really amazing incidents that happened with the SCO lawsuit, and that has coloured the free software community's debate about the law a lot since then.
Do a Google search on pump and dump.
On what?
Pump and dump.
Pump and dump, indeed, yes. The BitKeeper debate, we've already covered that one a bit on the source code management lecture, and why that was controversial. NVIDIA drivers is an example of proprietary drivers where NVIDIA released binary drivers for their graphics systems for Linux. It made NVIDIA graphics cards, which are extremely popular, run a lot better with GNU Linux systems, but they were proprietary. And there was a big debate over whether that's allowed. That largely led to the tainting system in the Linux kernel that I mentioned, and where Linux kernels are marked as tainted if they use a proprietary driver, and you can't get help from the kernel community if you use one of those proprietary drivers. That's also been somewhat resolved recently because a reverse engineered or partially reverse engineered driver called the Nouveau driver has come out, which provides fairly decent level of functionality in a free driver, a free software driver, not free as in beer. The NVIDIA drivers were free as in beer already. Sistina and the GFS was interesting. The GFS was a cluster file system, originally produced by Sistina, originally released as free software in the open world. But what was interesting about it is they tried to un-GPL it. They decided after being an open project to take it proprietary, right? And that's a very controversial thing to do. There's a lot of resentment that comes from doing something like that within the free software community. Can anyone predict what happened? Anyone tell us what happened when this company that produced this cluster file system decided they would make it proprietary from now on?
Someone forked it.
Fork it.
Someone forked it.
Yeah.
Right, indeed. Immediately somebody forked it, led by various people such as Alan Cox and others, and they created OpenGFS. And now, what happened after that, do you think?
Sistina had trouble sustaining their business model.
Sistina had trouble sustaining their business model. What happens when companies have trouble sustaining their business model? They get bought out. Who bought them? Red Hat bought them. And what did Red Hat do?
Opened up GFS.
Opened it up again. It became free software again. So it's been through the whole cycle. SSH and OpenSSH, rather similar. SSH was, you've already used it, you know, the SSH tool for communicating, for logging in, secure shell, copying files, etc. Its license evolved over time in rather strange ways. It was originally a free software license, and it became less and less free over time. The license, for each new release of SSH that came out, the license became more and more restrictive in terms of who could use it. So originally anyone could use it, then you can't use it for commercial use, then they changed the definition so that universities couldn't use it, and they kept changing the definition. So eventually it reaches a threshold, people got annoyed. What happened?
Someone forked it.
Someone forked it. What did they do? They went back to the last one that was clearly a free software license, they forked at that point, right, and released the new version under a open license. Okay, what's happened since then?
OpenSSH is huge.
The OpenSSH, the one that was forked, is the one that now dominates. The original company is basically irrelevant. The one that is forked is the one that now dominates, that everyone uses, regardless of it's proprietary or free.
How were they able to change the license though?
They had to choose a license that was compatible, and this was done by the BSD team. And the license they chose was deliberately legally compatible with the. They went back far enough in the history of the project and forked it from a point where the license was still sufficiently open to allow the OpenSSH project license to be used. Yep.
Coming to the license.
Yep.
Yesterday you mentioned about when I asked you about the Apache license.
Yep.
You said it's very respected.
Oh yes, very well respected license, the Apache license.
How is it very compatible with the?
There is a debate over whether the Apache license is legally compatible with the GPL, and one of the things that GPL v3 aimed to do was to resolve that issue, and there were members of the Apache board on the committees for the design of GPL v3 to try to make it more compatible. So the compatibility of licenses is a fairly technical legal discussion, and so that happened, those discussions mostly happened between lawyers and project leaders of the Apache project and the people who are designing the new license.
Apache is funding most of the open source.
Oh, Apache is very much an open source free software project, very open. It's just the exact words. Two licenses are only compatible if their exact words are compatible to a court. And so two licenses can both be free software licenses, but they can be incompatible. It's perfectly possible. And there was some debate as to whether the Apache license was compatible. Not all lawyers agreed one way or the other. Mozilla Trademark and IceWheels, we discussed that one the other day. And final bit of debate we'll have is cloud computing and FOSS. What's the issue with cloud computing and free software?
Are you distributing the software?
Right. Is if you have some, say, GNU General Public licensed piece of software and you use it in a cloud computing environment, so it's where it's computing as a service, as a web-delivered service, and the software is running in behind the web server, are you distributing the software or not? Most people would think you're probably not. In that case, you don't have to obey the terms of GPL and give out your enhancements, but maybe ethically you should give out your enhancements anyway, or for good business reasons, right, to lower support costs. But some people think the license should require the giving out of enhancements, and so in GPL version 3, there is a clause that you could optionally choose to enable to enable a requirement to give out sources even if it's used as a service in that way, and that came about from a free license called the Alfero GPL, which was a variant of the GPL that added a clause. That was the first license to add this type of clause. And interestingly, the Alfero GPL is an approved free software license, approved specifically by the Free Software Foundation and the Software Freedom Law Centre, but the Alfero GPL is not legally compatible with the GPL. Because the GPL says you cannot place any additional restrictions on the software, and that additional that restriction that you must release the sources is a restriction that is not allowed by the GPL version 2. So version 3 fixed that to make GPL v3 compatible with the Alfero style of licensing, which is in some ways more free than the original GPL, because it ensures that software modifications must be distributed even if it's used in a service type of context. And that debate is continuing to this day as to whether licenses should require that or not, whether that's important.
Have many major projects actually included that clause?
No, not many. Some projects have included it, but really it's the ones that are very much used in a cloud computing environment. But there's only a few that I know of that have adopted that clause. I don't have an exact number, but I'm just not aware of very many at all. Okay, so thanks very much. And now you've got a barbecue. So let's go out and have some sausages and enjoy some lunch, and then get back to your